Good evening, my name is Toby Lepati Mesme and you are listening to MesmePolitics. It's just gone 7pm on Saturday night, the 2nd of January 2021, and as always we have all the latest for you over the next half hour from UK and US politics with a unique leftist perspective, so let's delve in. So, coming up on the show, I want to talk to you about the state of play with COVID-19 in the UK. In summary, it's absolutely dire. The death toll, the hospitalisations, the spread of the new strain, we are in dire straits, and the opposition is asleep at the wheel when it should be opposing a criminally negligent government. Meanwhile, in the States, Bernie Sanders fights on the Senate floor, fighting to provide working class Americans the survival checks they need and deserve. And Joe Biden's cabinet feeds into the same lobbyist first approach that doomed the Obama administration to failure and landed us with Trump in the first place. They haven't learned anything. Is there any hope for the Democratic Party? But now, at the top of the hour, our top story of the day is a story of schools in Britain, teachers in Britain, and the Labour Party. We all know the government's negligent, but why is Labour neglecting teachers, and why are they still open? Why on earth are we justifiably keeping the schools open when we have the infection rates we have no safeguarding systems in place, the teachers don't have protective equipment, no one's clear on what's going on, and we all know another U-turn is basically inevitable? Why? And why is Her Majesty's official opposition taking a harder line on the unions than 60% of Conservative voters? Let's delve in. So, the government faces a major revolt from teachers and head teachers over its plans to reopen schools. Head teachers began legal action against the Department for Education on Saturday in an attempt to force ministers to reveal why they think it is safe to reopen schools on Monday, given the higher transmissibility of the new COVID-19 variant, particularly among children. The National Association of Head Teachers and the Association of School and College Leaders have instructed lawyers to write to the government, giving it until 4pm on Monday to share any information and scientific data that suggests it is safe for schools to return. The NAHT also plans to issue guidance to head teachers, which will recommend they take no action against staff who refuse to work because they feel it is unsafe. Unions representing teachers and support staff have called for remote learning. In a letter to the Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, the NASUWT General Secretary, Dr. Patrick Roach, states it is, quote, the only sensible and credible option at this time to minimise the risks to those working in schools and to safeguard public health. The GMB said differing arrangements across higher tiers was a dangerous recipe for chaos and was causing additional stress for parents, pupils and support staff. The UK's largest teaching union cautioned teachers on Saturday not to return to their classrooms on Monday over safety fears. The NEU, which represents the majority of teachers and more than 450,000 school staff in the UK, informed its members it was not safe for them to return to work until mid-January, return to physical school until mid-January at the earliest. Now, have a listen to this report.
The Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, has dropped his plan to keep primary schools in 10 boroughs in London open after pressure from councils. Our education correspondent, Dan Johnson, is with me now. Dan, there's another very swift change of policy here. Explain what's happened.
Yes, this decision was only made 2 days ago when the government, the Education Secretary, said that primary schools in some parts of London and in some counties around it needed to stay closed next week because of the level of of the virus. We can see on the map the areas that were involved. Some London boroughs and some areas around, they're highlighted in red, but not all primary schools right across London. And this caused some concern amongst local leaders, because you can see there the boroughs highlighted in red are the ones which had to keep children at home. The ones in grey were told that pupils would have to come in, even though some of those boroughs had been asking to close their schools before Christmas because of the level of the virus. And it was pointed out that the levels of the virus didn't seem to match which areas had been told to stay open, which had been told to close. And local politicians highlighted that some children actually travel across borough boundaries to actually reach school. So this evening, the Education Secretary says he has reviewed the decision and the data, and now all the primary schools right across the capital will stay closed next week. So that's more than 1 million primary school pupils now across the South East who will be learning from home next week. That's a challenge for parents in terms of childcare and home learning. It's frustrating for teachers, who've again highlighted that this is complicated, late decision making, but the Education Secretary says his priority has been to try to keep schools open wherever possible, and this is a fast moving situation. But Gavin Williamson got a bit of a reputation last year for making decisions then having to change them. It's only the first day of the year and he's had to change a big one again.
Dan, thank you.
That's a report from BBC News. Obviously, we don't endorse everything said in that. That is just, a snippet from the mainstream media. Now, I encourage you to get in touch throughout the show. You are listening to MesmePolitics. Come say hello in the chat. My name is Toby Lepati-Mesme, and let's see what the Labour Party has to say during all of this. We know Gavin Williamson is useless. We know the government is asleep at the wheel, but what is Her Majesty's opposition saying? Well, Kate Green, Labour's Shadow Education Secretary, commenting on the London primary school development, says, and I quote, "This is yet another government U-turn, creating chaos for parents just 2 days before the start of term. Gavin Williamson's incompetent handling of the return to schools and colleges is creating huge stress for parents, pupils, and school and college staff, and damaging children's education. The government failed to get mass testing for schools and colleges in place when Labour called for it, and they have failed to develop credible plans for remote learning when pupils cannot be in school. This U-turn was needed to provide consistency in London. However, Gavin Williamson must still clarify why some schools in Tier 4 are closing and what the criteria for reopening will be. School and college staff urgently need reassurance that the government is putting proper support in place to make all schools COVID-secure work environments." Okay, so what's the hot take on this? Well, the hot take on this is obviously the government is sitting on its hands, right? They've been worse than useless, and they continue to be worse than useless during all of this. They're messing up everything, including the vaccine rollout, which we will be talking about later. This is, objectively a farce. They are not taking action. They have the political capital to take action. They have the backing of the public. They'd probably be more popular if they took strong action. Why won't they do it? Firstly, because they are wedded to and fighting for an ideology of a service economy, low-wage jobs, people at work, and they really don't want to. They want the old normality back, and they don't like any form of support for anything. And it's ideologically uncomfortable area for the Tories. And plus, currently the education department is useless. We know over the last 10 years, the Tories' views, the last 11 years now, really, the Tories' views on education have been so skewed and so far from what the majority of teachers would tell you needs to be done, what the majority of people who know anything about the real world would tell you needs to be done. Another question, why is Williamson still here? He's incompetent, he's loathed by the nation's students, the nation's teachers, the teaching unions, Tory backbenchers, the entire Labour Party. I think you'd find a handful of MPs in the House of Commons that would defend Gavin Williamson, not many more than that. I've no idea why they're keeping him. He is the dud in the cabinet of duds. He should be gone. Leaving Gavin Williamson in charge of a situation like this is just begging for a disaster. The unions are right in what they call for. Also, I will support the unions if they decide that and it's heading this way, that basically the unions are going to take saving the country into their own hands, refuse to send the teachers to school, thus the schools closed by default. I would support that action entirely. It is clear that this isn't easy. School closures cause lasting harm, but right now, because of government failings, it didn't have to be this way, but because of government failings, we're going to have to shut down. The case rates are dire, and there is no credible way, especially with this new strain, we can keep schools open. We're not even close to having test, trace, track in place in schools. None of that infrastructure is built out. It will not be built out effectively over the next fortnight. The government remains asleep at the wheel on schools, unions are taking matters into their own hands, and the only way to guarantee schools continually remain open is to embrace the policy we should always have embraced: zero COVID. Labour have absolutely sat on their hands, and it's shameful when going up against a government this useless and this incompetent. Kate Green, the Shadow Education Secretary, has been absolutely useless. She's not saying much of anything. They're basically talking about competence, and the fact is, this is ideology, not incompetence. Labour seem to think they need to prove themselves by ignoring the unions, when the reality is there's little to no political expediency in 2021 in bashing unions, especially teaching unions. We could have had Rebecca Long-Bailey. It's very clear why Rebecca Long-Bailey was removed. It was not a moral panic about a retweeted article from The Independent. What it actually was the need, basically the Labour Party, and it can only be considered ideological because there's no political expediency in it. The Labour Party trying to deliberately separate itself and take an anti-union stance, an anti-union, anti-science stance on the issue of schools in this country. That's wrong. That's not Labour's job. That is the least Labour Party thing you could possibly do. And this is what we could have had. Rebecca Long-Bailey says, education unions need our support today. Everyone wants children in school, but with rocketing infection rates, it is time for Gavin Williamson to do his duty. Follow science and close all primary and secondary schools for a few weeks to all but key worker and vulnerable children. If we don't reduce the rate of transmission now, schools could eventually be closed for much longer. It didn't need to be like this. If the government had acted on concerns of education staff months ago, it wouldn't have been. Now, they must stop procrastinating and do the right thing. Absolutely right. That could have been leader of the Labour Party. She could also have been Shadow Education Secretary right now, if not for the score settling and ideological manoeuvring within the Labour Party establishment. Now, over to the States, there's a lot going on. First of all, Bernie Sanders is on the Senate floor, having the fight of his life. He was over the New Year, fighting to raise stimulus checks to $2,000. Survival checks for the American people. Have a listen.
Very clear. The working class of this country today faces more economic desperation than at any time since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And working families need help now. Not next year, but right now. Last night, the House of Representatives, with a 2/3 majority, 275 to 134, 2/3 bipartisan vote, moved to increase the direct payment going to working families from $600 per adult to $2,000 per adult. The House did the right thing. I congratulate them, and now it is time for the Senate to step up to the plate and do what the working families of this country overwhelmingly want us to do. Madam President, as a result of the pandemic, tens of millions of Americans have lost their jobs and their incomes. These families in the middle of the winter now face the threat of eviction and the possibility of being thrown out in the streets. Hunger in America is at the highest level that it has been for decades, with moms and dads struggling to feed their kids and working families lining up mile after mile to get emergency food packages. We are even seeing an increase in grocery store shoplifting as desperate Americans try to keep their families from going hungry. All of this taking place in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. Madam President, over the last number of years, as I think everybody in America knows, Congress has provided massive tax breaks for the very wealthiest people in our country, which is one of the reasons why today we have more income and wealth inequality than any time since the 1920s. In fact, in the midst of this pandemic, this terrible pandemic, inequality has grown worse, with many in the billionaire class seeing their wealth increase by hundreds of billions of dollars.
See, there you go. If anyone was ever wondering, that is how the left communicates. That is how the left gets its priorities heard in the broader public sphere, makes its cases morally, economically. Bernie Sanders, more than any other of the left populist politicians that have sprung up across Europe and in America, out of all of them, he is the best example of how you turn it into a victory of communications. And the result is there to see. The result is that Bernie Sanders is the most popular politician in the United States, right? Jeremy Corbyn was never the most popular politician in Britain. This is what you can do when you know your strategy, you're willing to be a canny politician, but you do not waver from your core values and your core principles. Absolutely brilliant from Bernie Sanders there. On the floor, fighting the good fight against, the hypocrisy of much of the Democratic leadership, which is much more about gestures than results. There is what I'm about to talk to you about demonstrates a very clear difference between, in terms of just removing Trump. There's a very clear difference between Biden and Sanders. It's not either way we get rid of Trump. No, if you get rid of Trump but don't leave anything in its place, there is a vacuum. That vacuum cannot be filled with third-way centrist nonsense. That vacuum will either be filled by the populist left or the alt-right. So, Biden administration opens the door to the alt-right. It's very concerning. It may shift the Overton window back to the right as resentment builds at the Biden administration, and if they don't deliver. And I'm going to tell you why they might not deliver. This is from the New York Times, a welcome bit of skepticism and scrutiny on their part of Democrats. President-elect Joseph R. Biden Jr.'s choice for Treasury Secretary Janet L. Yellen collected more than $7 million in speaking fees over the past 2 years from major corporations and Wall Street banks, but have a keen interest in the financial policy she will oversee after her expected confirmation to lead the Treasury Department. Miss Yellen's paid speaking appearances, which included $992,000 from the lucrative bank Citi for 9 appearances, were among the lucrative payments from a range of Wall Street, big tech and corporate interests to 3 prominent prospective members of the incoming Biden administration. Mr. Biden's choice for Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was paid nearly $1.2 million by a consulting firm he helped found, Westbrook Advisors, where he advised a range of corporations including Facebook, Boeing, the private equity giant Blackstone and the asset manager company Lazard. Mr. Biden's choice for Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, was paid $180,000 to consult for the data mining company Palantir, which has raised liberal hackles for providing data and surveillance services to law enforcement including the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Miss Yellen owns stocks in AT&T, ConocoPhillips, Dow, Pfizer and Raytheon. Mr. Blinken has a stake in West Exec Advisors. Disclosures worth a total of 1.5 million to 6 million. David Siegel, the executive director of the progressive group Demand Progress, says there are almost too many corporate clients to count who have relationships to the respective ambits these designatees would steward if confirmed, adding that this is an unfortunate circumstance, particularly as Mr. Biden strives to strike a difference between his administration and President Trump's. Now, this will not surprise many of you, it certainly doesn't surprise me, but it does demonstrate the point. There is a very clear difference between getting rid of Trump and actually replacing him with something worthwhile. The snarkish elitism from liberals who say just be happy with what you've got is shocking. If you're not prepared to serve working people with a populist, aggressive, progressive offer, then you have no place in frontline politics heading up the opposition to the Republican Party. Because unless you're bold, if you're timid, the Republican Party will walk all over you as they've walked all over Democrats for a very long time. This is what brought Obama down, this feeling of malaise and establishment competent technocrats. People who are just like, oh, they're sensible, let them get on. Again, it's liberal elitism. You're not going to sell to people who are really struggling that they're actually not struggling because someone's quote-unquote competent. Ridiculous. We need results, not competent technocracy. The corruption and the grifting that the Democrats have been responsible for in their presidential administrations is just carry on from what Trump did. Why have we got rid of Trump if we're willing to do the same thing? This is anti-progressive. It's under-scrutinised in the media. The media favours Democrats in the States because liberals pose no threat to corporate power, basically. The media is pro-centrist Democrat, centrist Republican, neoliberals, neoconservatives. They're biased against anti-establishment Republicans and anti-establishment Democrats. And I know which of those two I'd much rather get the upper hand, but I also know which is much more likely to benefit from whatever chaos ensues over the next few years. The look of this is, it's dreadful. And like I say, the lack of scrutiny of it is even more worrying, which is why, again, all credit goes to the New York Times for scrutinising this and publishing it, because it's something we really needed to talk about. Now, what's the latest on coronavirus and the new strain? Let's have a listen from BBC News.
New analysis has confirmed that the new variant of coronavirus has a much quicker transmission rate than the original strain. Researchers at Imperial College London say that even with a lockdown similar to that in England in November, the number of cases would still triple, and that this was the most serious change in the virus that we've seen. It comes as the government reported another 53,285 new infections. The surge in cases, particularly in London and the South East, has left NHS emergency staff at battle stations, according to medical leaders, with health workers exhausted and struggling to cope. Our health correspondent Dominic Hughes reports.
It might be a new year, but there's no let-up in the pressure on hospitals in London and the South East. A surge in seriously ill COVID patients means staff are being pushed to the limit. Intensive care beds are a real pinch point. Some patients have been moved from Kent to Bristol and Plymouth, where there's spare capacity. That in itself is not unheard of, but doctors say it shows the pressures they're working under.
If the number of cases don't begin to reduce fairly soon and indeed reduce sharply, we would be in a situation where the healthcare infrastructure, not just in London, but across the entire country, is overwhelmed.
And it's not just rising patient numbers. Staff themselves are falling ill, meaning resources are getting stretched.
Everybody's reporting a lot of pressure. Everybody is saying that it's really difficult to offload ambulances because our departments are full, because in turn our hospitals are full. It's very frustrating because you can't look after patients in the way you want to. And when you feel helpless, when you know that there's a sick patient in an ambulance, which you just can't get into a department because there isn't space.
In order to provide some relief, the Nightingale Hospital in London is being made ready for non-COVID patients. But still, hospitals report the situation remains very difficult.
When we are seeing major London trusts, as we've seen in the media today, basically saying that they are under real pressure, they are at more than double the normal rate of ICU admissions than they would see, they are turning whole floors into additional ICU space. That's when we know we're in a very, very challenging place.
This surge in patient numbers is being driven by the new variant of the coronavirus. It's more contagious and it's affecting more younger people. And it's having an impact not just on hospitals in London and the South East, but right across the country. And new research highlights the impact the new variant of the virus is having on the R number, the rate at which it spreads.
Under the lockdown, maybe over the course of 2 to 3 weeks, the cases would have decreased by something like 30%. But if the new variant is now present, with this increase in the R number, all of a sudden, instead of a decrease of 30%, we get a massive increase. The number of cases over the same period could triple.
So we're in a dreadful place. Message in from John says, too little, too late again. Johnson is inept, incompetent, and an outright liability. I completely concur there. The only problem is the alternatives to Johnson we may well be gifted with later in the year, if rumours are to be read as true, are often much worse than even Johnson himself. Many low and middle income households will face financial hardship unless ministers maintain support for those who have lost their jobs or experienced steep cuts in income during the second wave of COVID-19, Labour has said. The Shadow Chancellor, Annalisa Dodds, said in a New Year message to Rishi Sunak that the Chancellor must extend a range of COVID-19 rescue measures due to run out over the next 3 months to protect struggling households from financial ruin. A mortgage holiday scheme and a ban on home repossessions should be extended beyond the 31st of January cut-off date, said Dodds, while the £20 a week boost to universal credit, due to run out on the 6th of April, should remain in place until this crisis is deemed to be over. Analysis by the Bank of England in November found that 28% of households experienced a drop in income during the first wave of the pandemic, rising to 66% among self-employed people. Dodds said, whether employed, self-employed, relying on social security, or a combination of all three, Britain's beleaguered households face several cliff edges in the first few months of 2021. So, someone says, agree absolutely on Johnson. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing particularly controversial about saying the man's useless. He is, but the party's useless, and it's been shafting this country for the best part of 11 years now, so keep the focus on that at the same time. Labour is right in what they're saying. It's an absolute no-brainer. These things should be extended. It's good to see them step up and fight for such a thing, but at the same time, they need to add ideas. They need to beef up what they're demanding. I think Labour should be pushing for a UBI. They should be pushing for indefinite eviction ban, etc., 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 all the way through until the end of this crisis, and they should be asking for an entirely new economic contract with the people of this country coming out of the crisis. All these things would allow them to own the narrative of recovery, and they need to get starting laying that groundwork for 2024 right now. If they do, maybe they'll do well in the elections in May. The numbers we're seeing, the stories we're hearing are heartbreaking. As heartbreaking as they are scary, really. 57,000 daily cases, 58,000 nearly. Daily deaths, 445. Cases up 22,000 on the last week. Coming up to 75,000 total deaths, and that's the underestimate. Not a generous estimate. It is all, falling apart. Do not become desensitized to this. People are dying and dying and dying, and the government is absolutely failing. Do not be numb to it. The vaccine rollout was meant to redeem this government. It did look like it might do. It might save it from itself. You know, there'd be a feel-good factor, a polling bump, and we'd all forget about it. Problem is, they're cocking that up as well. By the sounds of it, what with all their logistical wrangling over first and second doses, transportation issues, and just failing to listen to the scientists who literally told them how to roll this thing out, the government is heading for a crash course with reality and a bungled vaccine rollout. So on top of all that, they're probably not going to be able to redeem themselves with the feel-good factor, because they're going to have bungled that as well. Zero COVID, for God's sakes, needs to be the strategy. We need a zero COVID strategy. We need to eradicate the virus. I've said it before, I'll say it again. We have a government that has a fetish for closing borders, so why don't they shut the borders for once and work to eradicate the virus from this island by putting in place, you know, test, trace, isolate, proper economic support, public hands, public health officials, support teachers, listen to unions. The reason is not cold hard fact. The science points out what I'm saying. The reason is ideology and politics. Primarily ideology, because politically this would, you know, the Tory party would be polling at 60% or 55% if they, you know, pulled it all around and saved the country with some sort of magical zero COVID strategy. It sounds, you know, like you're asking for too much, as it often does. One of the reasons Labour lost in 2019 is people didn't believe that the quite sensible policies were deliverable. People have been sort of downtrodden so much they don't believe change can happen. So people react with that scepticism of it's not possible. The really heartbreaking thing is this zero COVID thing is not only possible, it's very doable, and our government chose not to pull the lever on it. The fact they haven't pulled the lever on it is purely political decision making. And that's really hard to swallow, but it's true. The total is 10,000 more of deaths where COVID-19 is mentioned on the death certificate. Yeah, heading up 85,000, 90,000, all that in terms of excess deaths, etc., etc. So this thing is, you know, absolute chaos. We're not a huge country. We're not the US. Finally today, there have been some rumours. This is pretty much the end of the show, but you know I love a good rumour, especially a good rumour about the internal dynamics of the Labour Party. And this afternoon there have been rumours flying that Keir Starmer is set to resign his leadership of the Labour Party at 4 o'clock tomorrow. This is overwhelmingly likely to be a red herring. It does have links. Primarily it's shit stirring on Twitter, but it does also have links to sources within the Labour Party. Now, my presumption here is it's quote-unquote disgruntled civil servants, right? Not civil servants, but it's the equivalent of your disgruntled lotto officials. Wholly plausible. It does point to a broader problem that much of the Labour Party doesn't actually like Keir Starmer. The right don't see him sticking in the boot enough and not being Blairite enough. And the left see him as, you know, a disaster, which he is. An absolute disaster. And there's also talk of, you know, unions, rightfully, considering pulling funding because they're not being represented. I don't think Keir Starmer will resign. I think Johnson is far more likely to resign this year than Keir Starmer. But the pressure will ramp up if the local elections don't pan out. Of course, I want Labour to do well. And it does send a worrying message that they're refusing to represent teaching unions now. What will they do in government? You know, remember Blair seemed quite soft left before he went to government. Then he was, well, Tony Blair. Anyway, that's it from me today. That's your little... I didn't want to spend too long on that because it is an unsubstantiated and possibly unmerited claim. But we will see you tomorrow. Join us at 7 p.m. Tell your friends, subscribe, put notifications on. I've been Toby LePetty-Mesme. This has been MesmePolitics, bringing you all the latest in UK and US politics from a leftist perspective, and we'll see you soon. Have a terrific Sunday.